Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a piece of work that we're doing at the moment, building a marine carbon dioxide removal pilot plant in the UK as part of the CDR project, and so try and pull out a few very high-level lessons learned from that, which hopefully will be relevant to some people, but may be completely obvious to others. So excuse me if it's sort of somewhat patronising in some senses. Okay, so first of all, why marine carbon dioxide removal? And following from the previous talk, you've heard a little bit about what the ocean offers. There's lots of different criteria against which you can judge all the different carbon dioxide removal ideas, and really in lots of different niches, different ones will win. But two really important criteria to judge carbon dioxide removal on are the permanence of the removal and the potential scale of the removal. And if you judge them against these axes, ocean chemistry-based approaches for carbon dioxide removal really look very, very promising. And really that's around the massive scale that they can reach. So the diagram on the right-hand side just tries to provide a bit more context to that. What the red areas here show are the shallowest 1% of the world's surface waters. And using the approach I'm going to talk about in a minute, but you could equally apply it to a lot of different chemical approaches for carbon dioxide removal in the ocean. If you process this water annually, in my example, you're going to remove the carbon dioxide from that water. That's enough to remove about 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, which I would have said is what needs to take is what's required to take us to about 1.5 degrees C of warming, alongside really ambitious decarbonisation. But obviously, people are talking earlier about 20 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is accounting for the fact that we're not being ambitious with decarbonisation at the moment. But what you can see really is that the ocean isn't limited, right? It's not getting to 100 gigatons a year, 1,000 gigatons a year. You're not hitting constraints there from the ocean. So what are we doing and how are we removing this carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide, in terms of the volume compared to air, is very rich in carbon stored. That water can be brought into the pilot plant or into a plant where you separate the carbon dioxide from the water, and I'll talk about how that's done in just a second. The removed carbon dioxide can be purified for geological storage using sort of very standard CO2 purification approaches. And the low carbon water can be released to the ocean, where it's then absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's the really high level sort of schematic of what we're doing. And we're working with a couple of, or three different partners in the UK with a variety of different funding sources to build a pilot plant targeting 100 tons of CO2 removal per year. We're building that at the moment in the on the south coast of the UK. It's going to be operational this summer, and I think uniquely for this kind of technology, we're targeting a continuous 3-month operation period, which will be a first for this sort of technology, and it's going to be a challenge, but hopefully we'll really demonstrate that these things can operate for longish periods of time. In parallel to actually building the pilot plant and doing all the work around that, we're spending a lot of time demonstrating how you do the verification of the removal of the carbon dioxide, which obviously happens downstream of the plant, so isn't completely trivial. However, as coming from a background where we study natural carbon uptake, essentially this is a similar process with a much larger signal, so it's not prohibitive in any sense. We're also doing a lot of work to generate the evidence around the possible marine impacts of releasing low carbon water to the ocean. So low carbon water has less carbonic acid. It's a higher pH than the normal seawater. And there are no natural analogues for this. We don't know what the impacts should be. So it's really important that we get the baseline evidence around this. And the other big aspect of this work is understanding what the risks and barriers to commercial scale operation of this kind of activity is. So I'll touch on some of these as we progress through. So in a little bit more detail, how does this direct ocean capture approach work? Well, the reason why there's so much carbon dissolved in each cubic meter of seawater is that when you put CO2 into seawater, 99% of it turns into other dissolved carbon. So that's why there's so much carbon there, but it's also why it's really easy to get the carbon out of the water. If you take this water to pH 4, which is the pH of apple juice, all of that carbon becomes CO2. And we do this through an electrochemical approach where we are taking H2 and splitting it electrochemically into OH and H plus, so the acid at the base and the acid component there. When it's carbon dioxide, there's essentially a massive overpressure. That carbon dioxide wants to come out of the seawater, and through a single pass of a fairly standard sort of gas stripping technology, we can get 90% of the carbon out of the water. And what that gives us is is a gas stream that's about 5% CO2, which happens to be basically where a gas-fired power station is. So we can piggyback on all the technology that we've got to take flue gas to purity. Actually, in the pilot plant, we're using an activated carbon-based approach, which works quite nicely with the high humidity of the gas stream that we've got. We take that to essentially purity, so it can be compressed, transported for storage. So that's dealt with the CO2. We now need to actually absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide depleted water needs to have the same number of moles of base put back into it as we had moles of acid put in to extract the CO2. And then at that point, the water is released and it can absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, which will initially happen very, very quickly because there's a very strong air-sea CO2 gradient. And over a timescale of a year, but with most of that happening in a much shorter timescale, the CO2 will be absorbed and the seawater will have exactly the same chemical composition as the water that came into the plant. So I'm really happy to talk about that in more detail if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards. But I wanted to step back and say something a bit simpler, a bit broader from this. So I pulled out 3 lessons that I think we've perhaps taken from going through this process so far. The first one being that building stuff beyond the lab scale in the real world environment is absolutely essential if we're going to, break things quickly, if we're going to understand the challenges of scaling this kind of technology. And one example there is just understanding the footprint, being able to visually see this thing is absolutely critical to thinking about the challenges you're going to face. An example being, a really clever pre-treatment system that we developed over about a year in the lab to get the water ready for the electrochemistry required to generate the acid and the base. You build it, you realize that you've got half a warehouse full of tanks, and actually you take that to 50 kilotons, megaton, much bigger scales. Actually, it just becomes completely prohibitive. So actually building at larger scales is really, really important to just kind of visualize where this thing is going and what barriers you're going to hit. The other thing that's been really important is actually just working through the permitting challenges of doing this. On paper, permitting this activity is very, very straightforward. There's nothing in the UK that stops you doing it. However, getting a permit from our environment agency took about a year. And essentially that's because you're doing something new and it's new to them, it's new to you. And what we've been able to do is really understand the challenges there and hold subsequent workshops with the permitting bodies to really work out how this gets streamlined as marine carbon removal technologies increasingly are coming up in front of them. Another lesson that perhaps pushes the other way rather than kind of rapidly building big things is actually focusing on the theory is absolutely critical. So in many cases, it's been coming back to the real academic sort of nuts and bolts of this, the thermodynamics of the different processes that can really rule out ideas out quickly and focus you in the right direction. But importantly, these numbers are only really meaningful if you fully understand the system's operation. So one example here is thinking about the energy required to do the acid and base production from the seawater, this electrochemical approach, which is a really huge consumption of energy within the system that we're building. If you start from theory, as we did, you realize, okay, this is a great process that can be done very, very efficiently. You look in the literature and the performance of experiments again shows it's very, very efficient. And then you get to the real world scale and you sort of think, oh, actually, in this situation, we needed to produce water that had a slightly bigger pH swing because of other constraints in the plant. And suddenly that pH change actually is where the efficiency drops off and the energy consumption flies up. So then you understand how the plant actually needs to be operated in the real world, and you can calculate the real sort of thermodynamic limits of where it could perhaps get to, which gives you a nice benchmark to compare with other technologies and work out, is this the right sort of technique to be taking forwards? So, the kind of really academic side of this is absolutely fundamental to it moving quickly. And then I suppose the third lesson that we've sort of taken from it is that I think there's a really unique and underutilized role for universities and research organizations to be trialing technologies at significant scales. You identify different problems when you work at those scales, as I've said, and because we can identify those challenges and we're in a position to openly communicate those challenges, I think there's a real opportunity to avoid money, time, and talent being sent down dead ends in a way that perhaps the startups who are doing very similar activities to us probably can't communicate quite as honestly or as clearly because of the very sensible but very different incentives they have for their work. So very quick overview of some of the work we're doing. But yeah, please chat to anyone afterwards or answer any questions now.